everyone. It is Mike Levin on Friday, April 8th, 2022. I got on the road on the early side and it's getting darker later, so hopefully you'll see some of the gorgeous mountain terrain that I'm looking at. I feel like I should just point the camera outwards on these drives. The river level of the Delaware, which is just to my right, is super high right now and super muddy, super brown, which it is not normally because of a couple of days of steady, heavy rain that we received. So it's interesting to see the altered landscape after a heavy rainfall. It's probably the most flooding I've seen in my 2 years living in this area. Yeah, so professionally, personally, my drive, my talk, what's it gonna be? Well, spin the dial, the wheel goes around, it lands, well, it's rigged. It's gonna land on NBDev. And the continuing story of Jupyter Labs, which really changes the world. The latest install, I wish I had these versions numbered, something like 2.3.3-2, something like that. But it's the standalone desktop version of Jupyter Lab, which you get onto your machine with, say, a Microsoft installer, .msi file if you're on Windows, which you have to go hunting around for. It's hard to find. So given something that permanently and for the better improves the Python first experience story, the Python installation and getting started story, right? It's like, hey, in 2022, I decided to take up Python, so here's what I did. There's a lot of red herring paths. There's a lot of seemingly very appealing paths, and honestly, they do have legitimate pros in their pro and con column. You can open up almost any terminal you can find in Windows. The COM window, the PowerShell, there's a variety of them now today. And you can type the word Python. And when you do that, you will be automatically sent over to the Microsoft Store. The Store app will load. And it will install a very good recent version of Python. Really, it's 3.10 something. It's a newer version than you would get off of a Jupyter install. Jupyter's only up to 3.8 something on the standalone, so you can get 3.10, a newer version, by just going almost anywhere in Windows, typing Python. And because Python hired Guido van Rossum, the creator of Python, because Microsoft has built tons of Python support into their products, including VS Code, because Python is the obvious heir apparent of the lingua franca of tech. A lot of fancy words. Heir apparent of lingua franca of tech. What the hell are you talking about, Mike? Well, it is, and it will only increasingly be bundled with distributions, different distributions of Linux is what that means. When a language gets that blessed status of being the thing that gets pre-installed with the operating system, usually to handle a lot of operating system maintenance tasks that happen in the background, well, then you just became the new lingua franca of tech. It used to be Perl, P-E-R-L, P-E-A-R-L, P-E-A-R-L, no, P-E-R-L, I had it right the first time. The pathologically eclectic rambling lister, something like that. So it was made by Larry Wall. I always have to be careful when I say that, because I want to say Larry Page. If it's a page, it's Google. If it's a wall, it's Perl. And Larry Wall is a linguist, and he is a clever, cunning linguist who made a programming language that has incorporated in his favorite features from every other language. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, because the O'Reilly book for Perl is what kicked off the O'Reilly empire. If If it wasn't that, it was for the one for regular expressions or bash or one of those fundamental, truly pee in the pool of tech type subject matters. And the pool is gradually being drained, right? The idea of tools that are the pee in the pool of tech, it gets in there and it's never coming out, and because it's there, people use it. There's a handful of interesting apps on most Linux distributions called Awk, A-W-K, and SED, S-E-D. One is the streaming editor. It actually edits bit streams that pass through it. So it's a great way to do real-time filters on a pipe, on a data pipe. So you're piping data along from one command to another. It can take a little detour through SED, which can do something like a regex type manipulation on the bit stream coming through. Replacements, strip out all of something. So it's of enough common utility that it's just never going away, and people who know how to use that special magic can certainly do it. I have used the streaming editor, SED, from time to time. The other one is interesting. It's called Awk. I listened lately to the person who wrote Awk. I'm trying to remember who it was, because I was listening to a lot of the grandparents of computer science type things. Awk. I think it was written by, I forget his name, but he wrote the book on C. Kerrigan something? It might be John Kerrigan, but he was the person who was side by side with Dennis Ritchie, as Dennis Ritchie was actually writing the C programming language on which, Unix was, written, and created the whole, digital revolution, right? The digital age was ushered in because of portable operating systems. It's crazy to think about it, but a compiler that could be written for different hardware, that initiates the process, that kickstarts the process. Once you have a compiler by some magical means created, because there's a chicken and egg problem that's being overcome here, to have a compiler on a piece of hardware. It's like, where does that come from? From nothingness? But once you have the compiler on the special hardware, then you can compile the operating system and compile apps, and it kickstarts, it boots that new platform, and then your apps can flow onto it. So all one need do is boot a compiler, and all the app, and it opens the door to the operating system and all the apps to follow. And in such a way, you've got software reuse. Not every time that you write a piece of software, it's no longer for that one unique instance that you wrote it for. That's the way it used to be before things like Unix and other interoperable operating systems were on the scene. Operating systems were very frequently written for one and only one piece of hardware, like the IBM's compatible timeshare system, MIT's incompatible timeshare system, and all the other things that preceded Unix. And then Unix came along, it was highly portable, and then things that got written on that got ported along with the operating system. So things like SED and Awk get copied all over the place. People learn to use it. The VI text editor got that sort of blessing because it was one of the earliest full screen editors, and it didn't require quite the same level of lifestyle commitment, shall we say, as Emacs does. Emacs is a wonderful editor, but it requires a deeper commitment than VI. VI, if you just learn a few simple systems, you can just be using VI for the rest of your life. If you learn a few more improved commands, you could be using VIM for the rest of your life and have such improved features as undo. Yeah, I don't even think the original VI had an undo. And so, SED, Awk, VI/VIM, and of course Git. These are new. That's a newcomer. That's the newcomer to the scene. There was a bunch of software that could have been it beforehand. It was in the free and open source world. I think version control systems that went by I see if I get it right. SVN was the reversal of the letters, so the original one must have been SVC. SVC is a reversal. CVS, Content Versioning System, CVS. So there was CVS, and then there was later SVC. Play on words, just reversing the letters for different implementations of similar systems. But they were version control systems that used centralized servers. You'll find this recurring theme in tech of the desire to implement a centralized server system because somebody gets to keep control. There gets to be a keeper to the keys of the kingdom. And you will find this concept over and over in tech. Many people who lack actual creativity and the ability to add value to processes instead rather tend to like to master a few simple tricks, a few simple tech tricks, understanding permissions, user space, that sort of thing. And then they become the holders to the keys to the kingdom and can divvy it out upon need and request. And you sort of have to go to this person with your hat in your hand and go, please, may I have some more? And yeah, those days are rapidly winding down. Yours truly has released a distro of Linux. I was talking earlier today, or not earlier, I was talking earlier with one of my friends going through some of the different things I have in my Git repos, the ones that I actually keep public, because most of my GitHub repos are private for my own use. But of the ones that are public and of the sites that you see when you iterate through my sites in Google Analytics or Google Search Console, the things I'm teaching them, you will find Levinix. It's like, Levinix? What is that? Well, it's my own distro of Linux. It's really a respin. I'm respinning Tiny Core Linux, QEMU, and that's pretty much it. Popular binaries of the PC emulator called QEMU, which has some very creative networking context that makes it just a delight to do little projects on, because it's in a sandbox. It's in a virtual network in a sandbox, and they poof like soap bubbles. The very things that you would normally dislike a virtual machine or a container for, their propensity to suddenly go away, it's a benefit of Levinix, because I encourage you to log in with root level admin as the super user and to issue the command rm space /space -sign or hyphen rf. So once again, that's rm space /space hyphen rf. That totally nukes your system. Why would you do that? Because Levinix, you reset with a double click, and you got your initial uncorruptible, immutable, hardwired, static image of your operating system that gets running by just dumping that image into RAM. So you've got a virtual system in RAM. It's an instance of a virtual hard drive. It's using your fast type of memory, your DRAM, the good stuff, as your full hard drive operating system, because the operating system is pretty small. It's like 10 megabytes. So you're dropping a 10 megabyte operating system in the type of RAM that you probably have at least 512 megabytes of. Even a small system these days has 512 megabytes of RAM. And quite commonly, you'll have 2 or even 4 gigabytes of RAM for fast and it might not be truly DRAM or random access memory, but it's faster than the hard drive. It might be VRAM. There's some special memory that's sometimes put aside for manipulating things on the screen that lives in the memory of your video card, but it's still quite fast. And you'll have larger amounts of that than you would have of your normal DRAM, dynamic RAM. So your whole little Linux system is running out of RAM. There's no corruption. There's nothing you can do to mess up a hard drive. In fact, you don't even have to double click to reset Linux. You just restart it. If you didn't deliberately build a patch, it's just like Docker compositing with Tiny Core Linux. Every time you store the differences between your current system and your last system, if it's in operating system space, then it's applied as a patch, just like compositing layers in Docker. But you could have a /home that's mapped somewhere else and treat it with a slightly different technology. QCal, make it a QCal drive, and it expands on need. So your home directory can be persistent, where you keep your Jupyter notebooks can be persistent, but then everything else in your operating system is running out of RAM. So this tangent that I'm going on, is that Linux, Unix in general, and Linux in particular, because it's the most popular implementation out there, is a generic, robust little thing that you can treat like any one of your tech tools. Big Tech doesn't want you to know this, by the way. Big Tech doesn't want you understanding that having full control over a Linux system is no big. And getting rid of your fear is no big, because there's so many techniques today that make things safe, involving virtual machines and containers, that you don't have to have that with Raspberry Pis. You nuke your Raspberry Pi, you just reformat your SD card. You put your important files on some other device, preferably in repos in GitHub, right? So by having your good stuff, the intellectual property, the uncompressible, the irreproducible stuff, off in some other system that's not using tricks, it's not using quite the same level of ready to disappear like a soap bubble trick that virtual machines and containers do. A file you can accidentally delete and you lose your whole system. So you don't want to put your most trusted system only in one container file somewhere. You want to put your most important stuff also in repos, and probably in GitHub or other services like it, like Bitbucket, in private repos, so that they're with you for your entire life, and they're nobody's business. But, well, it's between you and Microsoft in the case of GitHub, right? So it's an interesting thing about the cloud and trust. You don't want to trust your data to anyone. You want it just on your own proprietary local machines and hardware, only readable by you. However, that puts the data at risk. While it's very secure in one way, secure against prying eyes and hacks and leaks and whatever, it's very unsecure against accidental data loss. You can often be one hard drive crash away from a lifetime of memories or financial records or whatever just going poof. So very typically you do decide to trust one of the cloud vendors, and they have various assurances as to your privacy. And even if you don't intend to entrust one of the big cloud vendors like Microsoft or Google or Amazon, you end up doing it accidentally or against your will anyway for 100 reasons. Involving Microsoft alone, OneDrive is a common leak where you end up sharing all your things which you think are going into your local documents folder, but because you have OneDrive turned on by default from your install, that stuff is being backed up to the cloud at a size of probably up to 5 gigabytes before it prods you to pay. And then it can offload it locally, and it has these wonderful features, these tightly integrated with the operating system features, where you get 5 gigabytes back. You know, if you don't access those files a lot and they're kept on your OneDrive thing, the next time you try and access it locally and it's been offloaded, well, it'll try and download it from the cloud. Just the way apps that have been offloaded from your iPhone, I guess Android does this too now, or did it first would be my guess, but you know, when your phone starts to run out of space, iPhone will just offload your apps. You got them in the cloud, you can re-download them on demand. Bandwidth usually isn't an issue with apps. So you gain back a little space, and these cloud tricks are used. And those same cloud tricks are where a lot of your personal data leaks happen on your home equipment. So yeah, you got to know about that. GitHub.com was bought by Microsoft. So, you know, they try and give you these assurances because you can imagine the number of competitors to Microsoft who hosted their code on GitHub and are now sharing their code with Microsoft. What? Think Microsoft is going to root through your private GitHub repos and like, hey, I'm going to steal that? These companies have so much on the line as publicly traded companies with reputations. They don't want to steal your data, and they don't want your data to leak. They don't want it to look like mud in their own faces for your bad web hygiene. So hence all this additionally privacy violating tech where your identity is tied to a phone for two-factor authentication. Oh, I told you folks, you nice folks at home, about the Unix operating system, which is also running on every Intel-based computer going back to Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge processors from like 10 years ago. You got a phantom operating system running with a full network stack, and you know, the vendors who made the hardware and anyone they're coerced into cooperating with have access to your system, even when it's off, even when that lid's closed. Because you ever wonder why over the past 10 years, Windows, which had such terrible performance and startup times 10 years ago, now has the same like instant startup as Macs? It used to be the joke, you don't need to restart Macs. Macs just always work. They go to sleep right, they come back right. They feel like they have universal memory, which is a thing coming down the pike, sci-fi wise, where your DRAM in your system has all the same attributes as your fast RAM or your USB RAM, your solid state, your SSD drives, solid state drives, except for slow access and heat and wearing out. So it's got the fast access of dynamic RAM, but keeps its state when you power off. So if you think your PC goes to sleep and recovers fast today using these privacy violating tricks, wait until we have pure universal RAM in the future, and it'll just be instant on and off. The distinction between on and off in electronics will just go away. Off is as good as on, because off is a frozen state that requires zero power to maintain it. So today's computers, and especially laptops, even though they appear to be doing that universal RAM trick, they are not. They have various power backed up through various capacity tricks, right? Because you throw a capacitor in and you'll have enough charge to do something on an emergency basis, like shutting the lid to your laptop real quick. You shut the lid to your laptop real quick, you know you have enough power. In a deterministic way, the manufacturers figured out that you will always reserve enough power to move enough state about your DRAM into a more persistent hard drive-like location, or a cache, a low power cache. You can use SSDs, it doesn't have to be hard drives. So with a little bit of battery power left in your PC, you can always maintain a low power cache snapshot of your DRAM state. And that gets you back with your instant on and off. I might not have the exact terminology right or the exact set of operations, but it's along those lines. Universal memory is being simulated with fast, just-in-time reading and writing of state. Now, where did I get to all that? That's kooky proprietary stuff. And the operating system that they have running in the background to manage that whole process is a tiny little version of Unix, not Linux, but Unix, using a microkernel design, not a monolithic kernel design of Linux, but a microkernel design of Unix that is more akin to the embedded systems of your QNX systems like that than it is to today's desktop Linux. Except it has all the same commands and you'd have just as much control with it if you logged in. So if you put a network sniffer on your network and that mystery network stack talks out, it probably has a different MAC number at very least than your inside Windows network stack. I'd have to look into that. I'm sure there's people who hack this all the time out there. But you can probably log into your Minix and have access to your Phantom Ghost operating system. But you should know about these things. It's just generic computing. And if you're a slave of proprietary software, if you're a Microsoft sheep, using VS Code, only able to use Git through VS Code, only able to use Jupyter Notebooks features through VS Code, then you're really missing out. You should be moving from VS Code-like environments, specifically Jupyter Labs, to more and more generic Unix/Linux-like environments, specifically the Bash shell, the command line interface, the Bash shell, the command line interface to the Bash shell through an SSH program, I guess is what I'm saying. Levinix, my version of Linux, gives people practice in doing that. In fact, it's a little harder than usual because SHA-1, one of the encryption techniques that is out there, has been thoroughly cracked and broken and is no longer considered secure. And all these old QEMU binaries and their SSH programs that come up under the older versions of Tiny Core Linux. So I have an older version of Tiny Core Linux on older versions of QEMU because they're established, they're well known, they're a good, litmus test for backwards compatibility with x86 hardware. And even if they have vulnerabilities, it doesn't matter because you're loading these things as a soap bubble. They exist in the virtual LAN. You click an X bot, a little X in the upper right, and the window disappears and they're gone, and it doesn't matter. And that concept of, I corrupted it by Xing it out without the proper shutdown, so it's Linux, it doesn't matter. So you learn to have emotional resiliency when it comes to computers with Linux. You should learn to have that emotional resiliency in other ways with computers. No single instance of any hardware should ever be that important to you. You should be able to reinstantiate your preferred working environment within an hour of sitting down at a new piece of hardware. And even that's probably too long. My coworker Tim tells me about all these things he does by plugging things into the USB drive that becomes the boot drive of the machine, and everything else about that machine is, of no consequence. You're just using it for its keyboard and its monitor and its CPU. Its processing capability, but not for any of its permanently fixed storage devices. It's a good approach. I should do more of that. However, I see it as just another dongle. I like Windows laptops. I like the Windows Surface laptops. I used to like the portfolio style design, the more expensive ones, whose monitors detach and allow you to flip it around. But after going through a few of those, I don't like it as much because they wear out, moving parts, the less going on the better. So, not the Microsoft Surface tablets. I don't like them that much. I don't like the flimsy little keyboards and the flimsy little kickstands. I've had them. I've had, I think, 2 Surfaces in my career. I think I've had 2. One was an employer-given one. I had to give that back. But I had a Surface laptop, Surface tablet, which I used as a laptop for a while. Screen eventually cracked, and I decided to move on. I moved on to the portfolio style thing, and not even a laptop, technically, not even a clamshell design, more of a fold-over design. Really unique, really showing how Microsoft is the new Apple when it comes to hardware. But I simplified. I said, what can I get cheap? What can I get so that I can get a new one for me and my wife and have us on good laptops and not get too emotionally attached to these things and not have too many moving parts of Yogi Bo, Lego, flippy, convertible, things. So the laptop. Good touchscreen. I'd like to use a good stylus on it. And it turns out the Surface laptops are a good way to go, because for about $800 you can get value out the wazoo. You don't have to be forced onto ARM 64 architecture. So people are talking about being on ARM. I hear people talk about, ARM 64 Mac mini servers, that should be in the compile chains of whatever. And I'm like, or you can just not use Macs as your development platform and just use, x86 and just use Intel x86, and everything you do will just work and be pretty high performance. I know the, Apple, whatever these new chips are, the M6, or I don't even know, but the Apple ARM designs, the hardware tweaks, the benchmark and optimization people are going, look what a wonderful job Apple did. Well, yeah, surprise, Microsoft was there first with their Surface X or whatever, Pro X or whatever. It was doing the ARM 64 trick on Windows, and it was like, yawn, nobody cared. But it was there, it did the trick first. It wasn't as highly optimized as Apple's ARM 64, but on both sides, you got driver problems. I was listening to my coworkers complain about things stopping working, particularly Bluetooth headphone things during our phone calls. And I'm like, yep, this was like Christmas season last year. I'm like, yep, ARM 64 architecture was out on both the Windows and Apple side, the Mac, or the Microsoft and the Apple side. New hardware, shiny new, highly desirable hardware, good price points. They could hardly keep them in stock, but drivers are what suffer. They can port the operating system, they can port the most popular apps, but every little mouse driver, Bluetooth headphone driver, every little thing that connects to your laptop is the casualty for a good long while these drivers are worked out. And then the compile and testing process is so much more complicated because Apple won't allow people to have emulated or virtualized Macs in most cases. So you can't just have a virtualized toolchain, compiled toolchain, cross-compiling toolchain. It compiles for x86 Intel, AMD 64, 32-bit, 64-bit, the ARM 32, the ARM 64, and so on. The Mac x86, the Mac, so on down the chain. And certain bits of those hardware profiles can't be cross-compiled. And when I say cross-compiled, compiled on one piece of hardware for another piece of hardware. The compiler knows enough about foreign hardware to make a binary for it. Really, really advanced voodoo stuff. So you can cross-compile to most hardware from the most popular hardware at the time. So of course, x86 is going to be able to cross-compile to almost everything else, except for where licensing issues on Apple prevents it from doing so. So it's always going to be harder to get the Apple ARM binaries than it's going to be to get any other platform. Sorry, people who like to wave that Apple, isn't it wonderful they got to ARM before everyone else flag. Well, they didn't get to ARM before everyone else, and you're least supported of the bunch on your binaries and your wheels. Oh, maybe they got to ARM before everyone else with the Apple Newton. So, where does that leave us? It was a discussion about NVDev, right? I started out with NVDev, I went to Jupyter, I went to cross-platform, I went to how valuable cross-platform know-how and ability really is. Oh, I cannot tell you how important it is to be able to readily flow between different hardwares, and just as important as between different hardwares is between different operating systems, the whole scale platform. You don't need it. You don't need anything from Windows. You don't need anything from Mac. You do need Linux or Unix, but you need it from any distro of Linux that supports System D, because you gotta have some commonality in your learnings. You gotta have some commonality in your learnings. I advocate Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. Capital L, capital P, lowercase v, lowercase g. The LPVG toolbox. You want to say stack, you want to say toolchain. It's neither a toolchain nor a stack. Things aren't built on top of things, although almost none of these is capable of being a runtime engine, right? There's GitHub integrations, Git integrations, so Git is running your code. Vim as an IDE, so Vim is running your code. Python, of course, runs your code, so Linux is running. So, you know, the argument is labels are stupid. Labels are stupid. I am Mike Levin. And, given that labels are stupid, what you're really trying to master is a grab bag of things that have labels, where the labels change as little as possible, and the grab bag of things with labels change as little as possible. And this labeled grab bag of things lets you do almost everything. Almost everything you want to do today, almost everything you'll want to do tomorrow, and far, far into the future. So, of course, tools do face, existential crises of identity, because the world changes and new languages are released, and the new languages seem to be a better fit for the new world, and the world changes forever forward because now there's small talk. Small talk perfected object-oriented design, but what brought it to the world? I don't know. Maybe C++ and Objective-C. It had to be in the C programming language, because that's where all your armies of comp sci trained programmers grew up on. Their computer science instructors told them, there is only one language, and that language is C, and things that share its curly braces close enough to be called C, likewise. So that included, in the comp sci departments, it included C, C++, Java, to a much lesser degree, Pascal. Pascal was, and Prolog, and were popular in some comp sci departments, and to even lesser degree, dialects of Lisp, like Scheme. But you see, Prolog and Delphi and Scheme, all going away in favor, usually first, of the C-type languages. Languages that use curly braces, that were derived from, once upon a time, Algol 60, I want to say, and which led to BCPL. BCPL was a language that helped boot the compilers, right? Because I was talking about first you port the compilers, but it's got a chicken and egg problem. So really you've got a programming language like BCPL, and later C, ported to each platform. And once you've got a language compiler combo, you can create the operating system and everything else you need. So a language that came before C called BCPL, enabled the Unix trick, enabled virtual machine technologies at the compile level, which helped portability. And then everybody's been claiming to invent this trick ever since, from the Java virtual machine, the JVM, to, internal optimizations in the GCC compiler, the GNU standard compiler in the Linux tool chain. What else claims virtual machines? Well, everything uses virtual machines, just-in-time compiling. Some of the only exceptions are things that take it that last little bit and say, we don't need an intermediary virtual machine language, a machine with different machine instruction code than the actual hardware you're running. Let's just go all the way and compile executables for the very hardware you're running. And the only virtualization level for hardware will be for memory management and, code isolation to protect against hacking and bugs in software and other things that can blow up in your face. So you can put your discipline in your virtualized hardware. It's no longer really virtualized. It's got something like a hypervisor, and whether it's virtual or not becomes just another stupid layer. It's resource isolation and protection. It's not virtual. It's partitioning of your resources so that they can not stomp on each other, not make each other crash, occasionally expand and contract on need, and other, resource management tricks that, for lack of a better word, we call it virtualization, and we call the things that do it the hypervisor or the DOM, different DOM than the document object model in web development, but the OpenStack virtual stack has one privileged minimal operating system that's used for this purpose, and they call that the DOM. So there's some overlapping language there. Point always being that there's gonna be the things that are given control, the things that are truly trusted, the things that run the show in reality are extremely stripped down Linux-like operating systems. Always. When you watch the boot process of most modern Linux machines, you'll see a stage called something along the lines of FS init or raminit, I think they use, because control is handed off from thing to thing to thing to thing, and one of the things that control is handed off to is a RAM-based initialization system at some 500 megabytes or so before control is given to larger operating systems that are mapped in on locations on your physical devices. Some light little bits put in memory that have special privileges, like your built-ins, the built-in commands in your shell fall into that category, always in memory. But everything else is loaded from your hard drive on demand from a different operating system that started to get your system booted. So if you can learn to step in there and take control at the init RAM FS step, you're like a tech deity. You can do things that other people can't do. And it looks all powerful and mysterious, but honestly, there's less going on. The vendor stuff is harder. It costs you more, and it changes more frequently. And that's where most people live. Everything like Microsoft Excel, most implementations of SQL, most of these notebooks like Mathematica and MATLib, most software in my industry, Screaming Frog and the different websites you subscribe to and log into, it's all proprietary stuff. And you pay for it, and it's subject to change, and your habits form around it. Well, you're chumps. You're all chumps. Every one of you is a chump. You're Microsoft sheep. Loot you later. Now, who am I to talk? I'm not careful with my money. I don't care about money. I'm a carpenter. I can just create it out of nowhere. I'm the knitting gold from hay kind of person. Give me a spinning wheel, put hay in on one end, and I'll spin it into gold for you because, you know, list tuples and dicts, data frames, pandas in general. When it comes time to scale, no problem. First, don't scale. First, work locally. Squeeze all the value that you can out of things like Sqlite. Sqlite is a non-vendor specific implementation of SQL that ships with every copy of Python. If you install Python, you've got a very handy database local, and using it isn't as hard as you think, because the hardest thing about SQL is that you're forced to deal in rows and columns, and you need to know what those rows and columns are. So that leads to the whole discipline of relational database management that works very much like Excel with rows and columns. But why? Why, when you've got a perfectly good database interface in the form of Python dictionaries? So the data type is abbreviated to just DICT, one of the worst technology names, but you use what you're given. So they gave us dictionary, we're going to use it. And the dictionary is very special, and it's hard to understand. And it's one of the secret weapons when you do, because if you slap the key value pair, name value pair, attribute value pair, what have you, people use NoSQL as if it were invented recently by the crop of databases like MongoDB, CouchDB, Redis, who pretend like they invented NoSQL, but it ships with standard Linux and Unix in the form of DBM. It's a built-in database manager. It ships with Linux. It's always been there. And then the grown-up scalable commercial version, well, that was Berkeley DB, and that was gobbled up by Oracle, and they deep-sixed it. Who uses Berkeley DB anymore? Just like they did with MySQL, right? Who uses MySQL if they can help it anymore over Postgres? So Oracle just gobbles up and, subverts popular free and open source tools that cut into their margins. Just saying. They're more evil than Microsoft in their own way. You just don't see them every day. But the same predatory practices are there. Microsoft at least reinvents themselves and puts out really cheap, high-quality hardware. So I like them for that. And I keep Windows on it instead of installing Linux over it because drivers. I want, Microsoft and all the game development and accessory development people to be on my side in writing drivers. I don't want them doing all that work writing drivers to benefit other people. Me, I want stable drivers for everything I might try and use. That means staying on Windows for a while. Windows 10 for me right now, but Windows 11 in the very near future to get that darn graphics subsystem on Linux. The Linux subsystem, full Ubuntu desktops without the time delays of, running X servers the way I do. So many sub-stories here. And it sounds like such big, complicated stuff, and I sound like such a technical guy, but honestly, some of the people I've grown up with and around, I am like a green noob in comparison. Where green? It's just projecting, right? I am a warm and fuzzy, yin-spirited blue circle. Right? You can see that here in my shirt, right? Star Warsy night. So I am the dark and stormy female part of the yin-yang symbol of, balance and harmony. But I dress up in the green arrow, the hunter's green arrow, because that's the world that, for whatever reason, because I was a child of the 70s and we were all running on empty while we grew up in these ticky-tacky Brady Bunch houses following the American Dream post-World War II suburban sprawl program, made us all feel rich, but at what expense? Poor inside. I'm one of them kids. I'm dead inside. Not really. So you use these tools I'm telling you about. You use, honestly, Linux, Python, Vim, and Git to structure your mind for life, because there's not really that much to learn. I am not a Linux guru. I'm taking it full circle there, right? If you know awk and sed, you're pretty hardcore Linux. Or Unix, Linux. I guess those are Linux. No, those were Unix. Those go way back, way back. They're part of probably the enhanced GNU command set. So what the heck are you talking about? So Linux isn't the desktop operating system. Linux is not even the set of command line utilities you use, like CD and ls, to get around in a terminal. Linux is a piece that you never interact with except when you power on the machine. It's the piece that breathes life into your hardware by having lots of intimate knowledge of your hardware, of your x86, of your ARM64, of whatever it is. Your Linux kernel knows about it. It consists of binaries that can be dropped right into location and magically have certain meaning. This is a lot of what they mean about kernel. Kernels are, really low-level stuff. So the Linux kernel has no API to it that a human being, that a normal operator of a computer would interact with. The command set, on the other hand, the GNU and Unix and Linux command set, you interact with all the time. You use the SSH program to get into a computer. You use the CD command to change your directory around. You use the ls command to list the contents of the directory. mkdir to make directories. rm to remove files. And then it's like, well, then why do operating systems even exist? Who cares what operating system is underneath of there if you just write the same commands on every piece of hardware? Well, the answer is there are APIs that start to come into play around the commands. So you're not just LSing, you're LSing greater than sign file name.txt, and the output of that ls has now been dropped onto your file, onto your hard drive, so that you can load it later and look at what the contents of the directory was at that time. You can do similar tricks with the echo command, the cat command for catalog, and people are always piping data, piping the output of programs into the input of other programs. It's such a common thing on Unix/Linux, in fact, that the API is the pipe symbol, the seldom used pipe symbol on the keyboard, the little vertical bar, which lets you pipe the output of one program into the input of another. So you would put a command, and just like you would use the greater than to a file name.txt, you would use the pipe to another command. The output of this program, and this is how things like the stream editor actually get strung up with other commands, so that there's another program. You got program A, you got program B. You're going to feed the information from program A to program B, but you want to strip out line returns. Carriage feeds line returns. So whenever a text file is generated by a Windows type machine, it has two characters at the end of every line. It has a What I know is a \r and it has a \n. So \n stands for new line in the way most people encounter it every day. \r stands for carriage return, back when old-fashioned typewriters had a carriage return and a line feed. One thing to turn the dowel that advances the paper by one line, and then another thing to advance the typing head back to the left side of the page. So it's a carriage return and a line feed. So those were separated on the Windows world for whatever reason. It's just as bad as the backslashes in their in DOS. So, a non-conventional thing, but they did it, and we have to live with it now. So a common use for this, and probably the single most common use for SED over the years, has been to strip out that extra carriage return in text files as data flows out of one thing into another. Got program A, got program B. Program C is inserted in the middle as a filter with piping. Sounds like super modern stuff of real-time systems. This is like 1960s, right? Late 60s, inventing Unix around 68, 69, 70. By the time 70 came along, I was born. The computer program of life was born. Complexity was starting to be appreciated. Operating systems became portable. And a drive 99.9 miles away from the Bell Labs research facilities in Jersey and New York, I was born in that suburban sprawl, getting the social programming du jour of the military-industrial complex, turning us into, double income sitcom, cereal munching, latchkey kids, watching reruns on TV to further perpetuate the program. It's not, for me, it's not my vibe. A friend of mine in college, Mike Welsh, was one of the first ones who said to me when I was looking at my life choices, he looked at me and said, "You're not suburban." And I just didn't know what he meant by that. I'm like, of course I'm suburban. I was born and raised in the Philly burbs. I bleed green. And it just ain't true. I'm either much more than suburban, I like urban. I like either don't want people around, or I'm like all urban with the meetups in New York. I was going to the tech meetups before you had to pay money and get reservations. I was just dropping in with all these startup people when meetups were a big thing, and the New York tech startup and tech meetups like that always had interesting guest speakers. It was very lively, and it was part of the good old days. It was almost as much the good old days as my Commodore experience in the suburbs of Philadelphia, which gave me a very skewed experience, I might add, about what being suburban was. I was like, hey, you can live in the suburbs and have the headquarters of a major computer company 40-minute drive away, and you can commute there and have your student internship there from college, right? Well, no, that was an anomaly. The Amiga computer that I fell in love with was an anomaly. The computer company that managed to get its hands on the Amiga and manufacture it being in my backyard was an anomaly. The chip company that Commodore bought, Moss Technologies, also being in my backyard in Norristown, Pennsylvania, it was an anomaly. And so I stumbled my way into this group of people that anomalously, because I knew at first they were anonymous, but then I got to know Dave Haney and all these wonderful people that inherited the Amiga from its creators, from the Atari engineer, Jay Miner, who actually did a lot of the really cool stuff about the Amiga, the hardware chip design. It was just so different from anything else that came before it. And so in a tradition that was Atari, but then not Atari because Commodore bought it, it was this very strange thing. And then the person who initiated all of this was a really hard-ass business person named Jack Tramiel. He was an Auschwitz Holocaust survivor who founded Commodore, built it up from like a typewriter company to a home computer empire. And as he was buying the Amiga from its creators, he was kicked out of Commodore and went to work for Atari. So the Amiga that should have probably rightfully belonged to Atari went to Commodore. And the president of Commodore, who should have rightfully been there running it right there with his sons and stuff, even though it was a public company and proprietary and all that, it would have had a lot more stability. The person who should have been at Commodore all that time went to Atari. Atari's hardware went to Commodore. Commodore's leadership went to Atari. Big swapperoo. People rarely talk about this. And the poor Commodore engineers that were working on next generation Commodore 64 stuff, the Commodore 65, and even more advanced stuff, Linux systems, real Unix systems. It wasn't Linux, but what was coming out of Commodore in those days was high resolution Unix-like systems that would have kicked the early black and white Mac's butt. Square pixels, high resolution special monitors, very, very, very not Amiga computer. Not video friendly at all. Commodore 65 might have been video friendly. So there were these two endeavors, the heir apparent to the Commodore 64 called the Commodore 65, which only ever reached prototype. We all saw the Commodore 128, but that'll have to be a whole separate video, that Frankenstein monster of multiple processors that made everyone happy and then made no one happy and came in with too high of a price point. So one of Commodore's favorite games was, is not invented here-ism. So they like to create stuff themselves. And the quality assurance people to play, it doesn't run like it runs on the Commodore 64. The backwards compatibility, pedantic, excessive, worshiping the altar of the past. Reverse compatibility, because if it didn't run Commodore 64 software, it couldn't possibly be successful. So there were always efforts to get Commodore's new hardware to run their old, blockbuster hit computers software. So these poor Commodore engineers who were in that mindset inherited this kooky piece of Atari-vibed hardware. And people like Dave Haney did the best they could under their instructions to bring it into the future with such wonderful technology as Zorro ports to auto-config hardware. The Amiga was doing things that were plug and play. The Amiga was doing things that was, not considered state-of-the-art until 10 or 20 years later. Computers are frankly just now catching up. The way virtual desktops work so smoothly to switch left and right between, a ribbon of desktops to create a seamless full screen experience between different apps that are running full screen. Very Amiga-like, and it only took 30 years for that to be a seamless, muscle memory learnable. You're committing it to muscle memory, a muscle memory committable experience of virtual desktops, so you could have multiple full screen apps. I remember very clearly the transition to full screen apps that happened on Mac. I was on Mac at the time when they started to do full screen apps, and how it confused the heck out of people, and how it was so un-Mac-like with sloppy Windows. And Windows at the time was getting arrow snap, where Windows you could just drag against things and it popped to full screen, and that was really nice. So I think, and Windows always had their full game apps, because video cards would go into full screen mode with DirectX. So I think these concepts were always more familiar to Windows PC people. So somehow or other, through some miracle, full screen app mode came into play, reached maturity on all three platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux desktops like GNOME and KDE. And while GNOME and KDE let you have more than a ribbon of virtual desktops, they let you go up and down for a grid, so you can go across and go up and down. I found that to be beyond human comprehension. I can go left and right in virtual desktops. I can't go up and down too and have another dimension. Call me two-dimensional. I can go left and right in virtual desktops, and I can switch now quite comfortably, muscle memory-wise, with about 5 minutes of readjusting to the virtual desktops as they're implemented under Ubuntu, as they're implemented under Macs, or as they're implemented under Windows. You make the first virtual desktop into a Unix/Linux full-screen terminal. It's always a full-screen terminal. So right off the bat, you are breaking your graphical desktop habit. Your one most damaging dependency in your life is that you need a bar of soap in your hand for a pointer, and that you have a forever changing Windows menuing system that you have to point and click to find and highlight and drag and drop. These things are bottlenecks. They throw off your flow. What you want with a good tool is one that becomes transparent to your executive function. The thing that says, oh, what do I do now? If you're tapping your executive function to use a tool, you're in some deep poo-poo. Especially like with driving. I can do a drive like this because everything about the driving tool has been pushed off into muscle memory, and the API has stabilized for decades. Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. Do you not see the picture I'm drawing for you? VS Code is like a car whose dashboard and steering wheel locations and gas pedal and the nuance of it all and how you gear shift all changes. It's only from one car manufacturer, and it gradually changes over time as they innovate. So instead, you could be using a text editor that came out in 1976, VI. You could use the improved version of it that came out in 1991 on the Amiga computer. Thank you very much. VI improved Vim, Fred Fish disk. I probably still have it. I remember my friends who put it at Tony Antonuccio, Jerry Hedden, Ed Gee. We would all talk about, I forget who prepared this disc, but it probably came on one of my Philadelphia Amiga user group discs also, which I was the president of for a while. Got us our room at Drexel University, territory of the Mac computer, because Drexel was the first college that required their incoming students to buy computers, and they required you to buy Macintoshes, and here I was leading the Philadelphia Amiga user group out of that school. For as long as I went to that school, I eventually graduated and they lost the room, such as it were, because as long as we had a student-sponsored club and a room and some facilities put aside to us, they would say, oh, this organization is renting that room. They do it once per month. So I was a real in at Drexel for quite a number of years. And yeah, that was quite a head kick. So I got used to tools that were almost universal, but not quite. Amiga's Intuition, Amiga DOS. But it cleared the way for Unix and Linux. When I made the transition finally to real Unix and Linux, I was like, I know this. I was like the kid in Jurassic Park. This is Unix, I know this. So what I knew was data piping from Amiga, because Amiga implemented that same vertical pipe for piping, the greater than arrows to output things, the general way of starting files, running script files. It was all basically the same. So wax on, wax off, right? I was learning Unix and Linux through the Amiga, through Amiga DOS, ARP and Crunch, without even knowing it. And so, when vendor tools started to let me down, when I started to be very wounded after Commodore going away and the Amiga computer going away, for all intents and purposes, really. It's just a hobby now, keeping it alive. It's not how you do your mainstream job. When you want your work and your skills to be applicable in the workplace, in the mainstream jobs, and most of the work that's available that requires clever thinking, right? So what we're doing is we're taking the same skills that people have in their head for solving crossword puzzles and Sudoku and, building models, model building, I would put in that category. A bunch of little technical things, which if you do these things, oh my God, you're totally the kind of person who can just make a great living these days being a data jockey, pushing data around or getting it from places, moving it to places, and doing various transforms of the data in the process, so that when it gets to the place you're putting it, the stakeholders, the people who need the data to make business decisions, either in a batch file way to look at attachments you send them, or an updated Google Sheet on a daily basis, or in a real-time system where maybe they go to some web or mobile app and it updates all the time because you're doing your stupid data tricks. Stupid data tricks are easy. Stupid data tricks are being literate in the modern world. Sorry to say it, but Python is the new Perl. Ships with Linux in most cases. Does most of the housekeeping work these days in back-end systems. No one in their right mind is going to choose JavaScript and Node.js to do system management. It's so much harder, and it's so much more overhead. More moving parts, more to think about, less, packages made for that specific purpose. No matter how big you think the NPM package manager for Node.js has become, another thing bought by Microsoft, by the way, NPM, of NPM install of Node.js. So Microsoft couldn't buy Node.js, the full web development stack, so they bought NPM. That was a private company, so they own the repo. So you thought it ended at GitHub? It does not. Microsoft just keeps buying things that are part of the must-use developer stack, but I digress. Python has really mature packages for network administration, everything having to do with deployment of virtual servers and machine learning and data science and all that, of course. It's just has such a head start and has so much of a already existing fan base and rapidly expanding. And I get back, it goes full circle, right? Because I'm always talking about the same things. The story of getting onto this panacea cure-all package, of which I describe, Python's not a cure-all, I'm sorry. It just appears that way until you run into such thing as pickle.dumps and pickle.loads, and then you realize, wait a minute, there's just two things wrong with that, maybe three things wrong with that picture. First, so what just happened there is I was going to pass someone who was moving slow in my lane, and as I was starting to move, someone was coming up like 90 miles per hour behind me over the Goethals Bridge, so I quickly got back into my lane. And it's a blue Lamborghini Countach, which we're going to be probably next to in a little moment. So even though his backfiring ass zoomed past me at 90, I can see him zigzagging lanes so I don't just casually pull up next to them. Gotta love Staten Island. So, stop me before I sub-reference again. Ugh, okay, traffic. I'm glad I left early. This person just hit traffic. I love it. Let's ground ourselves. The significance of Jupyter Lab being desktop installable, being standalone, separate from the Anaconda install. Clear, easy path onto Python, albeit an older version than the other routes that are easy these days on Windows. It is the preferred route because using Python in a web browser with what is known as a REPL, read eval print loop, exploratory coding environment is so much better than any other Python coding environment. Some people will tell you PyCharm, get onto a highly specific for Python text editor because it has all the bells and whistles. But I tell you, you're hardwiring yourself for another flavor of vendor dependency. Isn't it vendor dependency with Jupyter? Isn't Jupyter Labs some sort of vendor? No. Google Project Jupyter. It's all free and open source. All free and open source. And they seem pretty dedicated to it. Sometimes people reverse their decisions. They take the free out of free and open source, like Anaconda did. They changed their licensing terms. So if you do that huge install for all the things that go on with that, like is it the Spider IDE and Orange and a whole bunch of things I just never use. Maybe I should, but I never really touched them. And then the Anaconda Navigator, which was this heavyweight thing for just launching other apps. So I don't even want to load anything that heavyweight as software, much less something to load that heavyweight for loading other apps. Anaconda Explorer is the definition of the kind of thing I don't want on my machine. And so all the more reason that, it's about Jupyter. It never really was about Anaconda. Jupyter installs enough things from the data science, stack, what have you. It gets Numpy. And that doesn't even really matter anymore either, because all that stuff used to be hard to install because pip install did not have a binary wheels system to carry around pre-installed, ready to drop into place binaries for your specific hardware, right? The channels, the binary hardware channels I was talking about before that have so many that need to be produced to do it thoroughly. So usually they just end up having x86, Windows and x86 Mac, and the emulators will kick in and make that work on everyone's hardware. It's only just now kind of settling onto 64-bit so that there's only two versions to have 80/20 rule coverage. At least it's at that state. But the good side of the story is that all these various software installers, repository systems, or what have you, do the compile ahead of time if it's the type of software that needs that. A lot of stuff is written in pure Python and really doesn't need to carry around binaries, but a lot of things in the data science stack certainly do, Numpy being chief among them. The Numpy library, import Numpy as NP, something you do side by side with import pandas as PD all the time. It's a recurring pattern you ought to get used to. That couldn't be done in the past without compiling Numpy on your local hardware. And that was one of the reasons for Anaconda. Things were hard to get installed on your machine for lack of a wheels system under Python. So Anaconda and the Conda software repository. Now that the Python packaging index, pypi.org, has wheels for binary distributions, everything in the data science stack becomes much easier to install the need for Anaconda plummets, the desirability for standalone Jupyter skyrockets. And that's where we're at right now. So Jupyter so far has failed to do two things. One is to get their butt into the Microsoft Store so that when doing the install, so that it's easy to find, right? So first you got to find it through a blog post and on side links on GitHub, and you got to make sure you have the right version. And so it's hard to find. It's just, you know, who uses standalone Jupyter now? You know, me and a handful of other people who know it's changing the world. I'm always ahead on this stuff, trust me. If you don't hear about it from me now, you're going to be here. It's going to be like you discovered it anew, and you're going to be like, isn't this thing great? And I'm going to be like, I was trying to tell you about standalone Jupyter back in April of 2002. Did you listen? Well, you get to decide. I don't know. I'm an hour and 20 minutes into this video and stuck in traffic for the final leg of this journey, which is perfectly fine. Two things wrong. It's got to get into the Microsoft Store or something like it. And that takes care of the second thing that's wrong, which is the painful upgrade process. So when you install it, there's two components that are installed. It installs a server component, and it installs a desktop, which is also a server component, because, you know, there's two. It's weird, but it's your desktop component is also a server. But you got to uninstall the server component first, then you got to uninstall the desktop component. You have to do this through the Windows settings program under add remove from the systems option, I believe it is. And you have to do that between every Jupyter upgrade, every Jupyter Lab upgrade, which is frequent because it's new, it's bleeding edge, they're improving it. So the good news is they're making, so the upgrade. So once it's in the store, once it's in the Microsoft Store, so once you download it, it's hard to install. You try double clicking it, Windows warns you against it. You have to find this minuscule link to expand it. You got to tell it to run anyway, and then you got to do an operating system level, let this happen, and then I think another thing that you have to expand and let it run. So Microsoft is really trying to keep you from installing things you downloaded from the web onto your Windows machine. As well, they probably should. It ends up making Microsoft look bad. They probably roll their eyes a lot going, people are complaining about this stuff, but they installed it on their own system. So lockdown is tight these days against .exes and .msis that you download from the web. You have to overcome those defenses to get Jupyter Lab installed on your desktop. I actually experimented with doing this when Edge, Microsoft Edge, allowed you to turn any website into an app. It just had this server token thing I had to do that was a pain in the butt. So I actually tried to make Jupyter standalone before they did. And to some mild success. It was just fragile. That token got lost every once in a while, and I had to do this weird process of running it from the web browser, getting a token, plugging it in over there when I try and run it as an app, and then the app version would then start to run well for a while until it didn't. So I am super glad that the Jupyter project took it on themselves to make it standalone. It is the ideal candidate for a standalone app. It's just brilliant. And once the install story of Jupyter standalone, expect Microsoft to undermine it somehow. They're not going to let this happen. There's going to be something. It's probably going to be improvements to VS Code. They'll now suddenly support markdown cells or stuff like that. But once Jupyter can be installed easily and be upgraded easily on your desktop, there's no better path onto Python than that. That is the preferred way onto Python, because the REPL exploratory environment is good. You want to be running Python in a way where it never really stops running, where all your variables that have been populated so far are still floating around there to have their values inspected. All the functions that have been used in memory are still in memory, waiting to be used again. And you can actually write a Python program while it's running, layering on the next thing, layering on the next thing, without having to run it from the beginning all the time. And it seems like such a small point. And REPL environments, especially through CLI interfaces, have very much existed before. So why is it so different? It's so different because the dot connecting by this Jupyter organization, this project Jupyter, I got to get the names of the people behind it, is so well done. It's such a good implementation of access to a standard Python kernel, the cpython.exe standard Python of the python.org organization, just a few versions older. So you get real Python in a delightful, to use, it was first Ruby on Rails, liked using delightful for delightful, or joyful frameworks. They liked joyful. And then I've been hearing Jeremy Howard of NBDev, another thing that I started out talking about here, and fast.ai. He likes to talk about delightful. Learning environment, literate programming environment. Again, concepts of Don Knuth, in that coding, programming, terrible words, terrible labels for what it is, literacy in a technical sense, command over computers in like Mickey Saucer's Apprentice sense, but without creating network bitstorms, is very possible. Through just the mere process of letting it absorb over time with a bunch of little projects that'll really invigorate you, that will energize you, light you up, and connect to meaningful areas of your life that you care about, right? So being a pure data jockey, my things tend to look a lot like Excel spreadsheets, right? Ooh, very sexy. I'm trying to get into other areas of it, but your data is either key value in an easy to capture way, right? Because, you know, for this URL, I fetch this data. For this next URL, I fetch this next data. So why should it take anything more at the database capture level for your raw data to say, use this URL as a database key, here's the data. Use this next URL as a database key, here's the data. And if you want to get really fancy, you put additional columns in your database key and make it a composite key. So for this URL, for this date, here's what the API returned. For this next URL, for this date, here's what the API returned. And so on, so that you actually can have a space, a keyword space, for hitting against the same API every day and only once per day. Primary keys in a database. So you either want to work with things in that key value way for fast data capture, fast lookup using keys, or you want to work with things in a row and column way. Microsoft Excel, SQL Server, Relational Database Management System, RDBMS. What other terms are used for that? Matrix analysis, rocket science, numeric arrays, Fortran-like stuff, rows and columns. And sometimes ragged arrays, X arrays, there's different shapes of it, but, you know, numbers accessible on coordinates of, you know, potentially infinite dimensions in Hilbert space. So There's a few other types of data. These are the most common. The others would probably fit into one of these models. The other big one that jumps to mind is unforgiving Staten Island drivers. When you want to make a lane change, that's right where that person is going to speed up to be. Audi, in that case. Yeah. You recognize driving patterns for sure. I'm going to go to my old haunt and stand over South Beach for a minute before I pick up my kid, just to get a breather from this long video, hour and a half. I should probably wrap it up here. Who's still with me? Oh my God. Anyone still with me? Still listening to this? That's the end of it. You know, there's a couple of ways to deal with data, and you're collecting it in one format, usually named key value because APIs. You transform it into other formats, usually row columns because SQL and Excel. And on rare occasion, you do some other format transforms, like into network nodes, links, Lisp S functions. It gets back to row and column in its own way. Everything can be built up from primitives where two things relate to each other. Everything can be built up from one-to-ones. Long links, long chains of one-to-ones. Yeah, so many ways to think about these problems and to tackle them. And none of them are the right, pure way. There's always biases. Oh my God, biases. I never knew how much I've been biased and predisposed. I've talked about the issues in tech forever, because in tech, it very specifically is getting the wrong programming language too soon in your life. It's the way a generation of people were disabled by learning the basic programming language first, because 10 go to 20, 20 go to hell. Not the best programming principles in early versions of the basic programming language. Memory leaks all over the place. Untracked resource consumption. Infinitely nested loops without you understanding that is a problem. Line numbering, having to leave room between line 10 and line 20 because you might want to put in a line 15. This did not do any favors to me at 12 years old. And today has its own modern versions of it. I would make the claim JavaScript. And then the example I picked, that they had to implement arrow functions, anonymous arrow functions. And then they had to make alternative ways variable scopes work between anonymous, arrow functions and more traditional keyworded functions. So there's two different scopes you got to keep track of. As soon as I criticize JavaScript over that, I think, well, Python really isn't that much better. They got some unusual scope decisions regarding variables and loops, and they've got some unusual anonymous function decisions in lambdas, both in the keyword and in the insistence on it being one-liner with no token being chosen, like a square bracket, for allowing multiple lines, like they did with list comprehension. So Python has its rough edges. Pickle.loads and pickle.dumps. The S is for string, not for plural, because load and dump does the same thing but with binary file. But if you want the resulting file to be a string file in a limited character set with a lot of encoding, so it's more friendly to being saved on different storage media, you do dumps, and that's how you write it to something. So pickling is pickle.dumps. That's how you create a pickle. Use it with a context manager to drop it on the drive. And pickle.loads reverses the process, pulls it up, loads it off. I guess that one makes more sense to me. But I always do some quick little Lambda functions because of essentially my mental disability, not being able to remember the API of pickle. And my wife looks at this, and the first thing she does is start using pickle.loads and dumps in context where it's being done, especially on primary tuple keys. When you're using a tuple as a primary key with SQLite dict, it's got to be pickle. So anyway, so many sub-discussions here, and so many interesting, beautiful old scenes from my past. I might wrap this video up of just, no, I'm not going to do it here, even though this is a beautiful one. I'll maybe let you see it as I drive past it really quick. It's just the New York skyline. And I'll maybe do that one more time when I get to the place that I'm really driving and going to, where I actually just step out and go down to the beach where there's still some sandy devastation, some sandy destruction, and there's some very interesting bricks with the original manufacturer's names still on them, and interesting stuff like that that you can find there. So I guess this is where I wrap it up, I suppose. I like to put a fine edge on all of this. If there is a fine edge, it is that nobody has any idea, as big as Python seems to be now, especially in the face of the full web stack, right? How could Python be as popular as it is in the face of the full web stack? And I would go as far as to say, and with such a terrible name, it's not named anything like what the language is, the warm and fuzzy yin-like language, the highly accessible language. How could it still be picking up so much new users in light of all of that? And now then finally, it's going to be easier than ever to jump on the Python bandwagon with a robust standalone version of Jupyter Desktop. It's just friggin' big. It's huge. And as big as Python is today, it's going to get even much bigger tomorrow. And you're hearing it from me. You'll continue to hear it from me, but you'll also see it from me. And I'll be demonstrating this stuff. And hopefully you'll be along for the ride, and I'll be the on-ramp to Python for a number of people out there who haven't taken a step yet. And I'll show you the scene here. I can't see it myself, but I know that there's the New York skyline up there. There's some cool, I don't even know, would you call it ruins these days? Sandy. Oh, I can't zoom on this facing camera, so I'll feed my soul for a little bit and then pick up my kid, which is also feeding my soul. And thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon. And don't forget to subscribe.